Hi, and welcome back if you've watched any of the previous videos. My name is Tim Spees, and I am serving as a guide to the most important journey any human being can take, which is to find answers to the most important questions of life. Last time we learned of a critical distinction when trying to identify and know the designer that created the human race. We learned that the reason that the vast majority of human beings believe that a God or designer of the human race exists is because it is reasonable. That is to say, that it is reasonable for people to deduce that complex beings like humans did not just arise by accident or randomly, which is what naturalistic evolution teaches. Or, said another way, the reason that over 90% of the humans on the planet believe that there is a great designer or God responsible for the existence of human beings is because it makes sense, given their reasoning and their observations and experiences as reasoning beings. It passes the test of basic deductive reasoning, using the minds we were given. Complicated systems with interdependent components don't just happen without a designer. This fact was explored in detail in videos 5 and 6. In addition, it is self-evident to those who are not closed to metaphysical possibilities that a mere physical view of one's existence is inadequate to explain human nature, namely the ability to reason, to hold abstract thoughts, to intuitively know right behavior from wrong, to be touched or moved by beauty or acts of kindness, etc. These things cannot be reasonably explained using merely a physicalist view of physical matter such as atoms, molecules, proteins, and electrical energy. We used an illustration about computers to conclude that just as it is not reasonable to believe that a computer's hardware somehow accounts for or created its operating system and software, in like manner it is not reasonable to believe that the physical human body can somehow account for our mind, our ability to reason, our ability to know from right and wrong, our sentience, etc. In the last video, we defined two important concepts: God as well as religion, and we saw that they are related but clearly distinct. We learned that God, if he or she exists, is a being, not a concept or principle or belief. It is self-evident that created things require a creative agent, for principles or philosophies or beliefs can create nothing. Furthermore, we said that it is reasonable to believe that A, the designer designed beings that either reflect his or her nature or characteristics, and B, that the designer likes or values the basic characteristics or capabilities of the beings he or she created, and C, the designer has a purpose for that which he or she designed. For who designs something without a purpose for it, especially reasoning sentient beings? We also learned that religion is the beliefs and practices people have about God or a cause for their existence. Religion is not the same as any designer that may exist, but rather religion is people's speculations or opinions of what the designer may be like and what she or he might want. In general, many religious beliefs or practices generally have no objective basis, nor even a set of reasonable facts from which to reason. Please allow me to repeat that important point. Religion is the beliefs and practices people have about God or a cause for their existence. Religion is not the same as any designer that may exist, but rather religion is people's speculations or opinions of what the designer may be like and what he or she might want. In general, many religious beliefs or practices generally have no objective basis, nor even a set of reasonable facts from which to reason. Therefore, we learn that speculation about this great designer is the cause of most of the religion that people hold to. We concluded that when people are speaking about their God, it is unlikely that it is an accurate, complete, or full description of the actual designer of the human race. Rather, religious people in particular, have a set of basic understandings that a designer God exists, and then they do three things in trying to understand what the designer or God must be like. First, they assume that God must be like we humans, meaning that not only does God have similar capabilities or a similar nature, but that he or she also acts or behaves as we do, or thinks as we do. Second, they look to other people who claim to speak for the designer, either in the present or in the past. And third, they speculate or deduce from the first two things or from the designer's creation itself. There are serious flaws and fatal flaws with the first two methods of trying to understand the designer. First, to assume God has the same or similar capabilities or a similar nature is unreasonable, since the designer may not be bound by the same constraints as we are in the physical realm. While it is reasonable to deduce that he or she can reason, know right and wrong, have a sentient aspect to his or her nature where emotions are associated with certain thoughts or experiences, that is all that is reasonable to deduce. To believe that the designer has the same flaws and destructive tendencies as we humans do has no factual support. As we have seen, we humans have a will. We have the capacity for both good and evil, and we have the capacity to know what those two important concepts, good and evil, mean. Again, dear listener, do not make the mistake of failing to distinguish between capacities or capabilities of a being and the will with which to choose what we act upon. For example, we can use our ability to reason for good or evil. We can use our ability to know what is right and wrong for good or evil. We can even change what we associate our emotions with for good or evil. Our abilities or capabilities are not the issue. Rather, the issue is our will and what we can choose and do with our abilities. The human will is the deciding factor of all of those important decisions and the consequences of those decisions. If the designer also has a free will, then why must the designer use his or her will to choose evil? Just because humans regularly choose evil does not mean we have a reasonable basis to conclude that the designer does. Human history shows that we have the tendency to create God in our own image and likeness, oftentimes to justify our own faults or bad or evil behavior. The second flawed method people use to try and understand the designer is to look to other people to know what the designer is like or what he or she wants. This is the cause of most of humans' religious history and beliefs. While it is possible that some people might know the designer better than others, there is no good way to validate if those people's beliefs about the designer are factual, except one way. We will look at that one way in a future video. If claims about the designer cannot be validated, then we are right back in the realm of pure speculation regarding what the designer is like and what he or she wants of us. Finally, if the first two methods that people use to try to know the designer and what his or her will is for people are flawed, then the third method, deducing from the first two, will certainly be flawed as well. Suffice it to say at this point, it is speculation about the designer that causes most of the beliefs and associated practices of the major religions of the world. Please let me repeat that important point. Suffice it to say that it is speculation about the designer that causes most of the beliefs and associated practices of the major religions in the world. Religion, by its nature, does not use reason well to sort out its claims. This is the natural effect of not knowing much about the source, that is, not knowing much about the designer nor the realm in which he or she might exist. Since the designer is not present in a way we can detect with our five senses, it is reasonable that the people speculate. If we don't know much about something, then we are left with two options: not thinking about it, or speaking about it, or addressing it, or speculating. To speculate means to guess without a reasonable base of knowledge or observations to deduce from. As you can see by looking at the world's religions, the speculation method leads to many diverse results and conclusions about specifics, particularly a name for the designer and what he or she wants of people. The speculation and the resultant beliefs leads to contradictions, confusion, disagreement, division, contention, and sadly oftentimes violence in the name of the unknown designer, who is given a God name by the various thousands of religious groups. Ironically, one common belief of all religious groups is that their group has the right belief about the designer and that God favors them over others who don't have their correct beliefs. There has to be a more objective way to evaluate religion's claims, and fortunately there is. Would it not make sense that the designer of human beings would know what is best for human beings? Would it not make sense that the designer of human beings would want what is best for the human race if the compassion of which humans are capable was modeled on his or her own nature? Would not the designer and maker of the creator of people want them to know what they need to experience a good and satisfying life while on the earth? If there was a way to continue one's existence after physical death, would not the designer want his designed to know of that way? Of course, those questions imply a certain nature for the designer. So for you, the individual viewer, you should be asking, if this designer exists, what is it he or she like, and what does he or she want of me? That is a good and reasonable question all people ought to ask. The first consideration is, does the designer want to directly manifest him or herself to humans in order to communicate? It is possible that he or she does not. Is it possible that the designer cannot communicate with us on a physical plane? Is it possible that in order for the designer to communicate with us on some metaphysical plane, that we need to be in the right metaphysical condition or state in order to receive the communication? These are reasonable questions. Have you ever heard the saying, "It is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all"? I think there is truth in that saying, don't you? What about this saying? It is better to have existed and then cease to exist than to have never existed at all. That saying should make you a bit uncomfortable, since losing one's existence should be very unsettling. How about this saying? It is best to exist without ceasing to exist if we can improve over time and can exist in a good state. For knowing, reasoning, sentient beings with the capacity to love and to remember, ceasing to exist is a rightfully frightful thing to contemplate. All the good things you ever experienced and knew, all the people you loved and cared about, and those times shared with them, all the accomplishments you ever achieved, gone into the void of nothingness. This is the existential view that the so-called elite of the world offer to the masses of people. But is this what the actual designer and creator of humans set up? Perhaps one of the dominant thoughts of a created being should be gratitude toward one's designer or creator. As we have seen, it is obvious we have a creator. Therefore, should we not be grateful for their creating us? Don't make the "but my parents created me" error. Remember, your parents can't even explain your brain functions, let alone how you possess your ability to reason. And if they truly designed and created you, then they would have a clear understanding of their design. All your parents did was bring the raw materials together, and then the designer's magic took over to create you. As we have seen, we are not self-created beings. That is, we did not create ourselves. We are not responsible for our existence. Nor are we necessary beings, which is to say that there is no force or principle of nature that says we need to exist. Let's get back to the communication issue. If the designer wants to communicate with us, he or she has a few options. There are three basic methods the designer could use. The designer could communicate directly through some physical means. The designer could communicate through a non-physical or metaphysical means that humans could perceive. Or the designer could send a representative to speak for him or her. Of course, these methods are not necessarily mutually exclusive, meaning he or she could use all or some combination of these methods. Let us briefly consider the first method, which would mean some physical means of communication like a cell phone or some other such instrument. If the designer exists in a different dimension than we do, and if the designer does not have a physical body, but is rather a metaphysical being, then how would that bridge be gapped? Who would create the phone? And if the designer did, whom would he or she give it to? If the designer created a physical artifact like, say, the Mosaic 10 Commandment stones, then we could know some things about the designer, but we cannot know him or her well. Written communication is impersonal and does not lend itself to getting to know a person well. If the designer communicated directly to a person through some physical means, a voice from the sky, for example, only a certain people or number of people would hear it unless he or she did so all the time and did it globally. The fact this is not happening, for some reason, a direct physical communication is not a method the designer obviously uses to communicate. What about communication through a metaphysical means? This is possible, but perhaps it is so different than people are used to, it would not be very effective. As beings, we have a physical component, who have a physical component, we pretty much want things that affect us to be physical in nature because that is what we know and can feel and touch, and we can validate and thus are comfortable with. We have a trust problem. If the designer can communicate via some metaphysical means, perhaps we have to have the ability to receive that communication, and perhaps our ability to receive that communication is dependent upon a physical or metaphysical or spiritual state we must have in order to enable that ability. This is entirely possible and cannot be ruled out. Okay, what about the last method, where the designer would send a representative to his created race? This method has the following benefits. First, if the representative was like us, we would not be afraid. We as humans are easily afraid of things that are different than our normal experiences. Thus, if someone very different were to approach us, our natural reaction is fear, caution, and lack of trust. If the designer is a non-physical or metaphysical being, then his or her trying to approach us would no doubt cause fear in us. Therefore, sending a person would be a very good way to communicate with us. Furthermore, sending a representative would minimize the chance of error in communications, since the representative in person could fully explain things and answer questions. The good news is that the designer did send a messenger to mankind. This messenger is not a religion or a philosophy or a made-up fantasy. This messenger was a person, much like you and I. Next time, we will introduce that messenger. Until next time, be real. Get past the shallowness and pretentiousness of typical American life and find what you truly need.